privilege and my pleasure to hand things over to Rabbi Dovid Fink. Rabbi Fink received his rabbinic ordination from the Rockaway Five Towns Community Kollel and his Juris Doctor from the University of Maryland School of Law. Since 1995, he has been the owner and managing partner of the law offices of David Fink, where he specializes in litigation and has argued dozens of precedent-setting cases before the appellate courts of Maryland. He has published extensively on litigation and has been a featured speaker at the Judicial Institute of Maryland and the Maryland State Bar Association. He is a member of the Maryland State Bar, the American Bar Association, and the Maryland Advocates for Justice. He's admitted to practice law in Maryland, U.S. federal courts, and the Supreme Court of the United States. Dovid has also been featured as a scholar in residence across the United States, Europe, and Israel, and has written extensively on various topics relating to the Torah and Judaism. He and his wife of 31 years, Chaya Fink, live in Baltimore and have 7 children. So he also is, I will say as a plug, Dovid serves as a member of our board of directors for the Meyerberg and is an invaluable member of our team in helping guide us as a community organization. So we're really grateful for his involvement with us there as well. But today it's my privilege to have him speak to us this morning, and thank you so much for joining us, Rabbi Fink.
Good morning. It's nice to see everybody, even if it's through a screen. At the Meyerberg meetings, we often talk about the Bagel Boys as one of the centerpieces of the program, and it's really a privilege to see so many people logged on and to see so many of you looking so well. Many of you I know personally, and I appreciate you accepting the donation so that you would join today. We're going to talk about a few different topics today, all related to the same general topic. But first, we're going to talk about some of the differences between Jewish law and secular law. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the abundant similarities, with which there's much more similarities than there are differences. Next, we're going to talk about, after that, about how the United States was largely established on the foundation of those Judeo-Christian values, which found its way into the common law and secular jurisprudence. And finally, we're going to talk about how much of that has changed over the last 70 years. My understanding is we'll have a Q&A at the end, and hopefully I won't be so technically unsound that we won't be able to get through it. We want to talk first today about some of the evolution of American jurisprudence. For those of you who aren't aware, American jurisprudence after the Revolutionary War was basically an empty book. There were no laws, there were no statutes on the book to say these are the laws of the United States. So the United States adopted what's called the common law, which meant whatever the laws were in England for various types of things, property, tort law, criminal law, and things of that nature, were all immediately adopted as part of the common law and the foundation of jurisprudence in the United States. Now, many of those were changed very, very quickly, but specifically to reflect the values in the Bill of Rights and the United States Constitution, which was ratified somewhat later. But that's still the law today, which is that any law which was enacted in England and became part of the common law prior to the Revolutionary War is still the law in the United States unless it's been changed by federal or state statute. Now, at this point, many, many, many of the laws have been changed by federal and state statute. In the criminal code, for example, many things have different types of penalties. There's crimes now that are no longer crimes. There's crimes that used to be that were not crimes before that are crimes now, and things of that nature. So much has been changed, but nevertheless, the ironclad principle still exists, which is if something hasn't been changed by a federal or state law, the law as it was in England still is the law of the land here today. That's probably why we have so many similarities between Jewish law and secular law, because the English common law goes back many hundreds of years, which was adopted really from the feudal system before that. Much of it was, at least. So there's a long history of secular law dating back even millennium, if you want to go into certain details. So there's a long, long tradition of secular law, which traces many of its roots back all the way, believe it or not, to the Ten Commandments. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But first, let's talk about some of the similarities and differences between secular and tort law. I could pull out 100 examples, but start with tort law, for example. In tort law, if you want to be compensated by a jury for something that you went through, an injury you suffered, or damages which you suffered as a result of someone else's negligence or intentional act, in tort law, you're entitled to get your medical expenses reimbursed. You're entitled to get your lost wages reimbursed. And then there's a catch-all for something that's called pain and suffering. And many states, like Maryland, have even put caps on damages for pain and suffering because it's an intangible benefit, it's an intangible injury, and it's what we call non-economic damages. No one can see, you can't produce a receipt to show this is how much I lost in pain and suffering. So juries would sometimes go a little bit run away and run amok with million-dollar verdicts. So many states put caps on how much you can get for pain and suffering. But nevertheless, those were the damages available in tort cases: medical expenses, lost wages, and pain and suffering. Interesting, in the Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud, it specifies exactly what damages a person can recover if he's the victim of a tort or negligence on the part of another person. Those, of course, have Aramaic names there: Sar, Nezek, Boshes, and Ripoi. Ripoi is your medical expenses. Nezek is your lost wages. And Sar and Boshes are pain and embarrassment. Literally, the only difference between secular tort law and Torah tort law when it comes to damages is that the secular tort law calls it pain and suffering, whereas the Babylonian Talmud calls it pain and embarrassment. There's probably some subtle differences in there as well, but just to give you an idea, the tort law in the United States has evolved much over the last 250 years, yet it's almost exactly the same as what was in the English common law, and what was found in the Babylonian Talmud, which goes back to, of course, the 2nd or 3rd century. There's many other instances in the secular and Torah law where the patterns that we follow and the laws that we follow and the damages that are available and the other remedies are almost identical. Property law is probably the one area that has the most similarities. You can go pages and pages of property law where everything is exactly the same as it was 1,000 years ago or more. And part of that is because property law is one of the oldest sets of secular law that we have. It dates all the way back, even before the feudal system, there were laws about property. But nevertheless, much about property law went unchanged for literally a millennium. And it's no wonder that the property law that we have in the United States today, whether it involves easements or trespass or things of that nature, are the same as they were 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. Property law, though, contains one of the most really troubling areas when you're studying the differences between secular and Jewish law. And I don't want anyone to get too yawning that they're in this lecture with classes and my gosh, and I've got to hear about all this law stuff. Here's where some of this stuff gets really interesting, though, is where the differences are and exploring why those differences may exist. So in secular property law, there's a law called adverse possession. For those of you unfamiliar with it, adverse possession basically means that if John Smith goes into Wyoming and he finds 75 acres of wide open field, doesn't seem to be anybody there, and he just wants to park his RV there, live off the land, plant some vegetables, let his dogs run free, raise some chickens in the other corner of the property, just do whatever he wants. John Smith found this wide open land and he's just living there. The law in virtually every state in the United States is that after the prescribed period, usually it's either 15 or 20 years in the United States, after that prescribed period, John Smith owns the land, just by virtue of his having occupied it over the last 15 or 20 years, depending on the state that you're in. And the theory behind it is that, listen, someone's living in the land, and it belongs to somebody, and if nobody's bothered him in 15 or 20 years, either they've given up on it or something else of that nature, and we give it to him. It belongs to John Smith now because he's lived there for the requisite 15 or 20 years. There's a similar concept in biblical law as described in the Babylonian Talmud. In biblical law, it's called this idea of chazakah. Chazakah literally means established, and it really mirrors adverse possession in almost every detail. The Babylonian Talmud discusses how a person has to be in the property for the requisite period of time, It has to be open and notorious. It has to be obvious that the person's there so that the owner can't later claim that I didn't know anybody was using my property or living in my property. And there's a requisite time period according to the Babylonian Talmud also. It's shorter in Jewish law. It's only 3 years. But there's one big difference between the Torah view on adverse possession and secular view. In the Torah, in the Babylonian Talmud, you must claim after 3 years that I bought this property or I inherited this property. And the only reason I don't have my contract or my bill of sale to prove it is because so much time has gone by. And we don't hold it against somebody that after 3 years they can't locate an important piece of paper. So they're forgiven for not having their contract. Normally, if someone would claim they bought some property and they've only been there for a year, we would say, where's your contract that you bought the property? And they'd be obligated to produce it, or we'd throw them out if someone else had proof of ownership prior to that. But the law under the Babylonian Talmud, as described in Masechet Baba Basra, is that if you're there for 3 years, all is forgiven. We don't care about whether you had a bill of sale or a contract. If you claim that you bought it and more than 3 years has gone by, you own it. That's it. Now think about this one fundamental difference between adverse possession and chazaka. In secular law, going all the way back to the feudal system, if you claim that you were there for 15 years, you own it. No questions asked. According to the Torah law, that's not good enough. There's one other factor you must have, and that is you must claim that you actually owned it. You have to have claimed that you bought it. You have to have claimed that you inherited it. There must be some actual claim of ownership. If you simply say, I've been here for 5 years, no one's ever said anything to me, I planted stuff here, no one ever came by, under Torah law, that's not enough. You have not established ownership because you don't make any claim of ownership. You're not claiming that you bought it. And under Torah law, you must claim some legitimate right to title along with the fact that you've been there the requisite period of time. In secular law, you don't. This is absolutely a shocking difference because it's A, fundamental of who owns the property, and B, in every other area of property law, the Torah and the secular law are lockstep in harmony. Why in this one area is there a difference? So I wish we had a chance for some interaction here, and I know there'll be a Q&A at the end, but without that, let me just tell you like this. It's real simple. If you trace secular law back to where this idea of adverse possession came from, it came from the feudal system. By the way, much of the feudal system property law was largely adopted from Talmudic law. But they changed this one part. One part in all the hundreds of pages of property law, they changed this one part, which is that in adverse possession, you don't have to claim ownership. You just have to have been there the requisite period of time. Now, why do you think in the feudal system they would have done away with that requirement, that one requirement? They adopted all hundreds of pages of property law, lock, stock, and barrel, except for this one thing. They said, you know what, let's take that line out, that you actually have to claim that you have legitimate title or ownership. Why would they have done that during the feudal system? And if you trace it back, the reason is, when the feudal system was adopting their property law, the main thing that they were concerned with was not only ownership of property, but almost more importantly was who's going to pay the taxes on the property. Somebody's got to pay the taxes. And if somebody's living in property and they're there 15, 20 years and they're benefiting from the property and they're making money off their property, okay, you want it, it's yours now, but you've got to pay the taxes. The feudal system wasn't interested in who really owned the property. That was secondary. What they were interested in was that somebody had to be responsible for the taxes. So if you were there for the requisite time period, you're going to pay the taxes. You get ownership of the land and you owe the taxes. In the Torah, they're not interested in who's paying the taxes. They're interested in who actually owns the land. In the Babylonian Talmud, they're interested in getting it right. Who really owns it? Whereas in the secular law, there's another primal beast acting, which is that the government wants to make sure that they're getting their taxes paid. So in order to ensure that that important item was covered, they did away with this requirement of actually having to claim a right to title or ownership. You don't have to claim that you bought it. No, if you're there for the requisite period of time, we give it to you with the state's blessings, and then we come and collect our check. So it's fascinating how that one difference in property law can be traced back to the feudal system and really illustrates the primary difference between secular law and Torah law. Secular law was largely built so we'd have a functioning secular society with laws that people can know, look up, and be bound by. Torah law is interested in getting it right and what's fair and what's true. The Torah cares about truth, and that really gets us to our second point, which is how Judeo-Christian values were largely the foundation upon which Western civilization, and particularly the United States, was built. If you read the Federalist Papers or any other discussions prior to the adoption of the United States Constitution, and even the discussions between Adams and Jefferson prior to the Declaration of Independence, it becomes abundantly clear that the founding fathers of the United States were, A, deeply religious people. They had differences between them. There were legitimate different types of Christians, as well as Quakers and other types of variations on Christianity, and some Jews. But there was all this Judeo-Christian philosophy built into the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It may shock some people to know that when we talk about removing God from schools and things like that, God is referenced directly in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. This was not an atheistic society. Surely, under the First Amendment, someone who wants to practice life as an atheist and doesn't believe in God is protected. Anyone can believe and practice whatever they want to, as long as it doesn't infringe on someone else's rights. But to deny that the founding fathers in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence incorporated the idea of God into it, you'd have to simply deny history. The words are there, and they can't be denied. In the personal writings of Jefferson, Washington, Adams, and even Benjamin Franklin, you'll find many references to their religious beliefs and the fact that they considered it to be binding upon them. They believed that they were moral people. Now again, being a moral person and someone who believes in God does not mean that you've never done something immoral in your life. We all make mistakes, but I'm talking about the core values which they held up as something which is important. That was the foundation of the United States of America. In fact, the Ten Commandments are inscribed on the walls of the United States Supreme Court building. Christmas is a national holiday in the United States. That's not a coincidence. Christmas was a religious holiday. It still is, although largely it's become more secularized with the idea of a tree and giving presents and everything like that. But Christmas was originally, and certainly even still today on the books, a religious holiday. This basically continued up until World War II. Through the Spanish-American War, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the War of 1812, through all the different conflicts the United States went through in its first 150 years of existence, the Judeo-Christian philosophy was still the guiding light of the country. That does not mean there weren't other people who didn't subscribe to it. We were even then a nation of immigrants. Other people came in with other beliefs, and they were all welcome. But the overwhelming majority and the culture itself was a Judeo-Christian philosophy. And that really continued up until World War II. And then something dramatic happened. After World War II, the world was left with basically two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Those two arch enemies and foes had very different philosophies on virtually everything, but it boiled down to two things on each side. Number one, the Soviet Union was a communist society. It was a communist society and an atheistic society. As a matter of fact, many of the founders of Soviet Russia had the great quote that religion is the opium of the masses. We have to try to clamp down on religion. It can inspire people. It can cause them to do things for illogical reasons and be a threat to the government. I think it was Stalin, but I don't remember whether it was Stalin or Lenin that said that religion is the opium of the masses. But that's what you had on one side. You had a communist economic system, and you had a atheistic belief in no deity, God, or power of any kind. On the other side, we had the United States, which was a capitalistic economy, and a Judeo-Christian philosophy. Those were really the battle lines being drawn between the core differences between the United States and the Soviet Union. There were others, but those were the core two that meant everything. And over the 1940s and 50s, we kind of shortened that. We stopped talking about communism, atheism versus capitalism and Judeo-Christian philosophy. We started talking about communism versus capitalism. We shortened it for brevity or for whatever reason. It was much easier to say. The Russians and the Soviets were communists, and we were capitalists. That was why we had such differences. The communists were committed to expansion, taking over as much territory as they can, with the idea that the more resources they had, the more they could give to everyone in a more equitable way. At least so they claimed. Whereas in the United States, it was, listen, everybody's got the chance to live the American dream. Buy a piece of property, try to build railroad tracks, invent Apple computers, whatever it is that your dream is, you're free to pursue it. And to the extent the government regulates it to make sure that everyone's playing on an even playing field, that became more prominent. But nevertheless, those were the differences, communism versus capitalism. And then when we shortened it to communism versus capitalism, instead of also emphasizing atheism versus Judeo-Christian philosophy, then came the 1960s. The 1960s were a decade of basically free-for-all, which many of you are warmly familiar with. Everything was go. Whatever you wanted to do, you could do. There was no longer a taboo to drinking too much alcohol. There was no longer a taboo associated with doing illegal drugs. There was no longer a taboo associated with having children to people you weren't married to. Again, you'll go back to as recently as 1980, when a Hollywood starlet would become pregnant. She would routinely marry the father of her child so that the child would not be born illegitimate. Those were the words they used back then. No one of any stature had children out of wedlock. It was considered socially unacceptable. That's not to say it didn't happen. It did. But when Hollywood starlets, who are always the people who set the standards for all of us to follow, started having children with people they weren't married to, they would quickly marry them. All through the 70s and 80s this happened. And that stopped in the 80s. After the 80s, it then became perfectly acceptable to have children, planned pregnancies with people that you weren't married to. They may be a significant other, they may be someone you have a long-term relationship or not. But the point is that was no longer something that was critical to the society. Similarly, we had many, many staunch advocates for the idea of removing prayer from school. Why does prayer belong in school? Well, prayer was in school from time infinite because it was a Judeo-Christian society. And the overwhelming majority of people felt very comfortable with the idea that their children would say a quick prayer and a prayer for the government, in fact, when they went to school each day. But when the 60s came, it was an idea that, no, everybody can do whatever they want to do. I can do drugs, I can do sex with anyone I want to, with whatever gender they are, with whatever species they are. I can do whatever I want as far as illicit drugs, no personal responsibility. Everyone can do what they want. This idea of God was very uncomfortable for the people that were growing up in that generation because God, kind of lent you that sense of responsibility. I may have obligations to conform my behavior a certain way. At least that's what it was the first 150 years of the United States. Again, not to say that people didn't act outside the box. They certainly did. But nevertheless, they knew when they did it that it was outside the normal bounds of society. The 60s did away with all that. Everything was good. You want to smoke pot first thing in the morning? No problem. You can do that and still become president of the United States. In the 1980s, it used to be, before that, one of the first things they'd ask a presidential candidate, did you do drugs in college? And, Bill Clinton was the first one who had to face it, and he said, listen, I did, but I didn't inhale. Because even then, the idea that he was inhaling marijuana would have been so unacceptable to many people in the American public. Barack Obama changed all that. He said, of course, everyone did pot in college. And much worse, it became socially acceptable. But it wasn't like that the first 150 years of the country. And when we changed this idea of communism and atheism versus capitalism and Judeo-Christian philosophy, a lot of these things came along with it. Maybe for better, maybe for worse. That's something that you have 100 people, you're going to get two different opinions on it, no question about it. But factually, that's what happened. We took the Judeo-Christian philosophy out of the country. The 60s said that everything was fine, everything was good, whatever felt good you could do, and that was great. We took prayer out of schools, a lot of things that were part of that same thing to get God out of our lives. It's interesting when you think about it, though, because the emphasis of capitalism over communism obviously wasn't the end-all, be-all. But when the 1980s came at the end in 1989 and the Berlin Wall fell, it was viewed differently. This was no longer viewed as a victory for Judeo-Christian values and capitalism over communism and atheism. It was viewed strictly as capitalism won out over communism. Indeed, many commentators pointed out that the reason the Soviet Union collapsed was because their economic model was unsustainable. The United States was building advanced weaponry, and the cost of keeping up with them was simply something the Soviet Union couldn't keep up with their economic model and their economy constantly in disaster. So many people lauded capitalism as the legitimate winner of the Cold War, and they were right. But they totally factored out the fact that one of the things the United States was fighting for, and one of the reasons we felt at odds with the communists after World War II, who had been our allies, was the fact that we had values that they did not share, largely based on Judeo-Christian philosophy. That all was lost in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. After the 80s, we had a simple philosophy. Capitalism won, and that was good. Everybody remember the decade of the 80s? There was a motto introduced in the 80s. Does anybody remember what it was? Greed is good. That was not an American value in the 60s. That's not to say there weren't people looking to get wealthy. There was always wealthy Americans. There was always entrepreneurs and business people that built the railroads and all kinds of stuff where people developed oil and got to be vastly wealthy. But no one dared say greed is good. That wasn't an American value. In the 80s, that became a bumper sticker. Greed is good. Capitalism won. It defeated the evil enemy of communism. And this really sunk into our vernacular. Not only that, along with greed being good, there became an element of selfishness. We lost this idea that we have to help other people. That was something which was a bedrock of the United States from its inception. Prior to the United States being a country, does anybody know of any other country that gave huge amounts of money to other countries in foreign aid? The United States introduced the idea of foreign aid. Yes, it's true, going all the way back to the time of Cleopatra, there were money exchanged between different countries for goods, for values, for treaties. But the idea of helping other countries out of benevolence simply didn't exist. Prior to the 1960s, the world was focused on one simple thing: survival. Everyone had to do whatever they could do to survive, to make sure they had enough food to eat, to make sure they could provide shelter for their family. Again, there was always some wealthy people who lived beyond that, but nothing like we have now. And because of that, we have organizations that exist now. Take PETA, for example. Does anyone think PETA existed in 1824 or 1864? PETA is a great organization devoted to the compassion and fair treatment of animals, a very Jewish value, by the way. But why is it that there was no PETA until the mid-1900s? Simply put, because we didn't have the convenience and the luxury of money like we have now. We were worried about ourselves existing, let alone the animals. Similarly, do you think there was an Environmental Protection Agency in 1880? Of course not. The environment was here to make sure that we could grow crops, export and extract minerals from the ground so that we could live and survive and eat. People didn't have time to worry about the environment. We were worried about survival. But as the decades went on and values went out of the picture, and we now had wealth like we never had before, wealth was a great thing for America. Because when America got wealthier, as the only time in history that the world's sole superpower after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as the world's sole superpower, we were not interested in persecution and proliferation and expansion. Every other country before the United States, if they were the dominant power on earth, they used it to persecute, to prosecute, to take land, to take resources. That's simply factual. That was not the case in the United States. Again, the United States has its own stuff that they can answer for, whether it's taking over Indian properties, whether it's the deals they made with Mexico, with Spain, and the Louisiana Purchase and other places, and other types of the purchase of Manhattan Island for the equivalent of $24 in costume jewelry. The United States has its own things to answer for. But no one like the United States existed to the tune where they didn't persecute and prosecute their neighbors for the gain of the United States. Every other country in the history of the world did that until the United States. Then came the 1970s, again, a pivotal change in history. Something creeped into the American political system, a slogan, kind of like greed is good, except it was different. The new slogan was, "We can't be the world's policeman." Everybody remembers that, right? And it makes a lot of sense. We can't spend billions and billions of dollars in foreign wars and stationing troops all over the world. It's simply too expensive, and that's not our job. Our job is to protect the United States. And this idea that we can't be the world's policeman was echoed by Democratic and Republican politicians when it suited them. But the fact of the matter was, we could, and we had been. For much of the 1900s, we were the world's policeman, and that led to the most prosperous generation in history from 1940 to 1980. It led to the creation of PETA and the Environmental Protection Agency. It led to all these things that showed and showcased American values, because now we were there to make sure that some despot in Asia and some crooked person in Africa and some unethical person in Europe was not going to try and do things to the demise of everybody else. There were aberrations. We had Bosnia-Herzegovina. We had types of genocide going on there and things of that nature. But post-Holocaust and post-World War II, with the United States acting as the world's policeman with troops stationed in 44 different countries around the world, we had the most prosperous and the most peaceful. It's not to say there weren't, areas that were inflamed and had to be dealt with. Human nature being what it is, there's always going to be those things. But nevertheless, it was the most prosperous generation in the history of the world, where the lone superpower of the world could be the world's policeman, and in fact led to a reduction of world starvation, led to the development and spreading of medical treatment. When there's a typhoon, a hurricane, a tsunami anywhere in the world, there are two countries that are the first ones to lend aid. Every time. That's the United States and Israel. They are the first two countries, every place, to set up field hospitals for their own personal citizens to go there as physicians and help out. There is such a thing as Judeo-Christian values, and that's one of the reasons the United States always had a special relationship with Israel, because we shared these values. But foreign aid, find another country in history that had this idea of foreign aid. I'm going to give millions of dollars that our people earned to some other country? That would have been grounds to remove the king's head. We worked for that money. What are you giving it to another country for? There better darn well have been a good trade reason for it. But the idea of simply giving money, and of course the United States often gives its money because they're expecting strategic balances for it and help, but they often give it out of benevolence. In fact, the last CARES package that was passed by the House of Representatives contained a lot of that money to help many good causes, which people thought were very important around the world. Nothing to do with strategic alliances, but simply to share our values with other countries. And that's the important thing to remember. The United States was a country founded on Judeo-Christian values. It served the country very well. And the only reason that really evaporated was because of the Cold War and the conflict with the Soviet Union, how that shook out and how that developed over time. It became that greed was good. Capitalism won out over communism. But we did pay a heavy price. We lost a lot of it. And we lost a lot of what made our country great, the care and the compassion. No one doubted that we should send people to help people that were earthquake victims in 1950 and 1960. That was part of who we were. No one doubted the American Red Cross or the United Way were fundamental organizations devoted to helping people, and that wasn't appropriate. And we're now getting to that point. We're getting to the point where even an organization like CARE, which delivers aid all over the world on behalf of the church, is sometimes viewed as a less than charitable organization because they pick and choose sometimes where to send their packages to. It's just not part of our values. We don't pick and choose. We help people because they need help, not because they look like us and they dress like us and they act like us. But this idea that the United States and Jewish values, obviously Judeo-Christian values, are intrinsically twined, takes me back to what I want to conclude with. I'm a student of history. I get a big high out of the Talmud and Jewish history and the Torah intersecting with recorded secular history. Secular history really gets a little bit sketchy prior to about 1000 BC. You have hieroglyphics going back to ancient Egypt, but the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month recordation of history is very sparse before ancient Egypt. Yet we know civilization, man's civilization, existed for almost 6,000 years altogether. We don't know exactly what was here before then. Were there dinosaurs roaming the earth? Were there Neanderthals? We can all argue about that from time infinite because none of us really knows for sure. But we know that there was a recorded history of human beings existing for close to 6,000 years. What's fascinating, though, is if you study Torah law, or whether you study the Torah itself, not just Torah law, if you study the Torah and you study secular history, there is a very strong parallel in certain things. And I'm just going to share one of them with you because it's absolutely fascinating to me when I discovered it. And when I discovered it, I spent a considerable amount of time researching it. I wish we could interact here and ask for people to shout out. But again, most people are aware of who the first secular king was in recorded secular history. The first king ever recorded in secular history is Hammurabi. Hammurabi, many of you know, is responsible for the forming of the very famous Hammurabi Code, which was the first set of written laws known to mankind. Hammurabi's Code sits in a place of honor in the Supreme Court building, as do the Ten Commandments. The Hammurabi Code was first discovered on an edifice many, many feet high that everyone can see. It was a proclamation driven into stone for everyone to see that these are our laws. Developed by Hammurabi, the first king in secular history. Interesting, if you look in the Torah, the first king referenced in the Torah, in the world, was after the Great Flood. Noah and his children come out. There's only about 15 people in the world. Noah, his sons, their wives, their children. And they come out, and that's all there is in the whole world. And shortly after that, about 80 years, 100 years, there's a king referenced in the Torah. That king was Nimrod, or Nimrod. What's fascinating to me is that through all the datings that we have of Nimrod, and Hammurabi, we can place them to almost within 80 years of each other, which when you're going back 5,000 years is a startlingly closeness. The fact that we can place those two people by historical events within 80 years of each other is absolutely astonishing. That's like finding gold buried under your bathtub. That's just not supposed to happen, that we can find two people from ancient history and be able to place them within 80 years of each other. That's practically getting a blood match and DNA match between two people that have never met. It just doesn't happen. What's really fascinating, though, is if you explore the midrashic interpretations on the Torah, going back to the story of Noah, it tells us much about Nimrod or Nimrod. It tells us, for example, that he's mentioned in the next week between the battle of the 4 kings versus the 5 kings. And in that story, he's referred to as Amraphel. And the great commentator Rashi there says, Amraphel zu Nimrod. It's the same person as Nimrod. And he goes on to explain that many people in those times, and we know this from secular history as well, had more than one name. And Amraphel and Nimrod were the same person, the commentators go on to tell us. And they go on and tell us other things. For example, this famous king, Nimrod, had many other names. But his essence, Nimrod, was to be a moraid. He was to be a rebel. He was always the person at the top. He was always the person leading. Nimrod, throughout his life, was always king. And all of his names, therefore, had in Hebrew what's referred to as a mem and a resh. Those are the 2 Hebrew letters, mem and resh, which form the the M and the R sound. And because that is the root of the word for moraid, to be a rebel, to constantly be the one driving people under your control. What's fascinating is that Hammurabi has that same signature line in it, the MR. Every name that Nimrod had an MR sound in it. Amraphel, Nimrod, and many others, and Hammurabi. Another great coincidence. But here's what I just want to conclude with on this topic. This idea that our society and the original United States Judeo-Christian values are fundamentally intertwined with Judaism and Torah law. This idea of Nimrod goes back to one other totally separate commentary, which describes Abraham, our forefather. Abraham confronting Nimrod when he's building the great tower. The Torah records at the end of Parshas Noah that the people of the world wanted to rebel against God. So they're building this giant tower. This is what led to the dispersion and the 70 nations and people having their different languages confused, etc. Until then, the world was unified. There was one people. They were being led by Nimrod. And they built this great tower. And the Medrash goes on to say that Abraham went to Nimrod and said, don't do this. God doesn't want you to do this. This is a rebellion against him. As a matter of fact, there's other commentaries which say Noah himself went to Nimrod, who was his great-grandson, and said, don't do this. I was around during the Great Flood 120 years ago. And God's going to get angry. He's going to punish you. Don't do this. And Nimrod didn't listen. The Medrash goes on to say that Abraham went to Nimrod and said, I've been given through prophecy God's 10 commandments that he wants me to follow. He wants you to follow, and I'm presenting them to you. And Nimrod said, I don't recognize God. I don't know who that is. I don't have to follow anything. And then finally, there's a separate commentary that says that after Abraham survived being thrown into the furnace, Nimrod and him made a kind of friendly parting of the ways. And Nimrod said, you know what? I'm not sure I'm in for this whole 10 Commandments things, but the left-hand side of the 10 Commandments, those seem to be all about man and his fellow man. And it seems to me those might be grounds for producing a good civil society. That's what the Medrash commentary says from the year 400 AD. In the year 400 AD, they said that Nimrod decided to adopt the second set, the second side of the 10 Commandments, the left-hand side. Coincidentally, those commandments are essentially what is the Hammurabi Code. So this idea that Judaism and Christian society and secular law and Torah law are intertwined is not some kind of pipe dream. It's supported by secular history. It's supported by the Torah and its commentaries. And more importantly, it's supported by our actions. The United States became the greatest, most charitable, most moral country in the world. It's not to say we don't have problems. Everyone does. It's not to say that as good citizens, we don't fall on different sides of the political spectrum where we may not always agree on everything. But that was one of our rights given to us, the right to disagree and the right to be on different sides, as long as we knew that to the core, we're good people. You know, I tell people this all the time when I'm speaking to predominantly Jewish groups. I said, I don't care whether you're Orthodox, conservative, Reform, or non-affiliated. I have more in common with any Jew than I have with a non-Jew. And I can tell you the same thing applies largely to people who subscribe to the old American culture. I have more in common with Americans than I do with almost anyone anywhere else around the world. Because we did grow up in such a society where we do care about other people, where we are generous and we are benevolent, and we generally care about our neighbors. These are inherently Jewish values. It's something that made America great and continues to make us great again today. Thank you for letting me share these ideas with you. I'd be happy to take a few questions.
Thank you, Rabbi Fink, for speaking to us this morning. So a couple of questions have come in through the chat. The first is from Val. So I think maybe she would request a clarification about what you said about, I think, adverse possession and ownership of land. The question was phrased as, so the Torah says you can lie about ownership. I'm assuming the answer is no. So I guess maybe could you explicate a bit about that in terms of property rights and what the Torah says and what secular law says?
Right. The fundamental idea is that the Torah is not going to give you a piece of property simply because you've been there for a substantial period of time. The Torah's whole exegeticism in the Talmud about discovering is who owns the land? Who's the legitimate owner? If you bought the land, why don't you have a contract? And if you didn't buy the land, we're not going to give it to you. The Torah is interested in having proof. And once a certain amount of time has gone by, like adverse possession, your failure to have lost documents, your failure to have secured important documents is overlooked and forgiven because things do get lost over time. But the Torah will never give anyone property unless there was at some point a claim of ownership. That 5 years ago, I bought it, or 5 years ago, John Smith gave it to me. There has to have been a claim of ownership. In adverse possession, we could care less where you came from, how you got there, or who was there before you. You've been living there 15 years, now the property belongs to you. And again, because the difference is, in secular law, we're interested in who was going to pay the taxes. Under Torah law, we're interested in who's the legitimate owner of the property.
So on that note, another question has come in from Bob, which is, can you claim that the land was given to you under religious law? I'm assuming that's a reference to sort of what the Torah is talking about with the Bnei Israel, with the land of Canaan. And in feudal systems, suppose one entity pays the property taxes for the 15 years that someone is squatting on the land. Can the squatter still claim ownership? So could you speak about, I guess that's another question about squatter ownership and title and stuff like that?
A very astute question. That's actually where one of the sources for squatters' rights came from. It was indeed during the feudal system that this idea came about that if someone was paying taxes on the property, but someone else was living there and working the property and acting the property, that's a more powerful act of ownership than paying the taxes. And the way the law developed was that we can't trust that because someone out of benevolence who's living in Zimbabwe wrote a check to the government for the feudal system in Europe where their property was, we can't trust that they're going to pay the taxes next year. We don't even know where to send a bill to. We need to know that the person living on the land is going to pay for the property. You can rent, and there's deeds and mortgages, and there's lease agreements which provide for that. But we always know who the owner is and where they can be found. If an owner is an absentee owner, and the only thing we know is that someone else is living on the property for 15 years, if they can prove they've been there for 15 years and that the owner has been an absentee, and the owner can't show a lease agreement or something, because if they can show a lease agreement, that does change things, then the person who's lived there owns the property.
And another comment has come in. It was in reference to what you said. It was Karl Marx who said religion was the opiate of the masses.
Yep.
Karl Marx.
You'll all find out when you get to be my age that those quotes tend to, you forget exactly who said them. I had thought it was Lenin or Stalin, but you're right. Now that my memory was refreshed, it was Karl Marx. Yes.
Right. All at the end of the day, they're all communists. So. Another question has come in from Roz and Ted, which is, when did secular law eliminate the biblical rule of an eye for an eye, or did it not? Could you talk about that? Yeah,
the idea of eye for an eye as a literal thing never existed. The Talmud spends a great deal of time discussing that those things were meant metaphorically, and we do interpret them to be the value of an eye. For example, if someone poked someone's eye out, we would estimate how much, if someone wanted to sell themselves into servitude, which was not an uncommon thing in those days, someone couldn't afford to pay their bills and they wanted someone else to take care of them, they could sell themselves into servitude and say, my master will take care of me, he'll take care of my family, he'll feed me, he'll give me shelter, and in exchange, I'll give him a day's work every day. That was not an uncommon practice in those days because, as we said, there were people who were wealthy and many people who didn't have enough food to eat. So what would happen, though, is we would take the value of, let's say, your 50-year-old man, and he wanted to sell himself into servitude for a 10-year period. How much was he worth? And let's say it was, $40,000. And how much would that same slave be worth if he was 50 years old but only had one eye? And if that dropped the value from $40,000 to $12,000, then your measure of damages was $28,000. This is all codified in the Talmud way back in the year 200 and even a little bit before that the eye for an eye was never a explicit thing, never to be taken literally. It was always a translation into money. You wonder where people got this idea that Jews were concerned with money. I don't know. But even from the days of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, everything was translated into the comparative value that a slave would have with that organ or without, and the value that's changed in between them.
So I wanted to, I had a couple questions for myself, and I sort of wanted to shift to the second part of your topic. And the first question I think I just had, I was curious to get your thoughts on is this, the idea of capitalism and markets, because markets always don't work. And I'm curious, what does Jewish law or Judaism say about free markets and free exchange? And because, there is a lot in the Torah about this in terms of, you have the Jubilee year where you forgive all debts, and you have the Shemitah year where you let the live land fallow. So could you talk a bit about that in terms of what sort of economic system the Torah or Jewish law sort of envisioned for a society, and what, and how does that differ from what we have?
Sure. I mean, there's some core elements there. First of all, the Torah does largely have a capitalistic type of economic system. However, as Elliot points out, there were certain caveats to that. First of all, property was given out by tribes. The idea was that it's contained in the Torah that every tribe had different talents. For example, one tribe did mostly merchants and retail and wholesale. I don't know if Jews ever got into that business for real, but there were tribes who were into wholesale and retail. There were also tribes who were into shipping and had the coastal lands. There were other tribes who had skills in the manufacturing and crafts and making of gold and silver and copper and brass into different type of equipment and weapons. There was always tribes with different abilities, and the land was given out to give them the choicest lands for each one of those resources. For example, if a tribe was identified as having great talents in the area of shipping, then they were given coastal lands. If some tribe had skills in the ideas of bringing minerals out of the ground, they were given some of the choicest land, which was rich in minerals. But nevertheless, the idea was to maximize the potential of every tribe. Now, on top of that, though, what you can't escape is that even though it was largely at that point then given to each tribe to maximize their resources to the extent they could, there were certain central things. And I'm glad you brought this up because it's so central to the Judaism economic system. There's things called leket, shikha, and peah. Those are requirements of any landowner to leave the corner of their field, the parts of the produce when they're harvesting that they drop, for the poor. There's obligations to give a tithe to support the Levites and the priests who didn't have any land of their own. The Torah law not only had a capitalistic economic system, but it was drilled in and built into the system that we all have an obligation to our brothers. It was very much a system that not only assumed, but dictated that we would be charitable to each other and compassionate to each other. So the Torah was a very interesting combination of a broad economic system, go be a merchant, go be a shipper, go be a farmer, do whatever it is that your land and your talents allow you to do to be as prosperous as possible. But everybody has to remember to take care of their brothers.
Right. The other question I had sort of ties back with, thinking about the American Constitution and our sort of way of life, which is this idea of separation of church and state. I guess my question is, it seems as far as I understand that, that sort of concept doesn't really have an analogy in Judaism of that sort of that sort of separation of church and state, or separation of religious power from political power, so to speak. Or maybe I'm mistaken. So could you sort of speak about that in this context?
It's actually a topic that I've spoken at great length about in various other venues, but there actually is. If you go through the Torah law and the Tanakh in general, which tells the stories of the conquest of Canaan and things of that nature, there was prophets. There were prophets in the secular world too. Bilam, who's mentioned as the primary prophet of the Gentile nations, but prophecy was apparently not so uncommon in those days. But Judaism always had their prophets from the time of Abraham down through Moses and then later to David and Solomon. There were always prophets. But nevertheless, there were different roles for the prophet to play. Samuel, the prophet, was perhaps the most central. He was the one responsible for choosing Judaism's first leader. Judaism had periods of time where they had a prophet, but no real leader. There were judges, what we called shofets, who led the people from time to time, until there came a time when the people requested a king. And Judaism is set up to be led by a monarchy. The house of David is the ultimate monarchy, which will be the dynasty for all time. There were other dynasties from the tribe of Benjamin prior to that, had the King Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, but once David came along, all future kings were to come from his tribe. And there was no question the king was the absolute ruler, even if he disagreed with the prophet, which is a really strange separation of powers if you think about it, because the prophet's the one who's talking to God. The prophet's the one who's got the direct line. And if the prophet says, listen, I really think we should, retreat from this war, too many people are going to die, it's too much of a conflict, it was still up to the king. And the king often didn't listen to the prophet. Much to Judaism's peril, it usually turned out that way. But nevertheless, there's different talents and different roles for different people. The prophet was the holy man. He was the one to give you advice on a spiritual level. But nevertheless, executive power was entrusted into the king. The king was the one who had the absolute right to choose to listen to the prophet or not to listen to the prophet. And there was a further check on this division of power. Much like we have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch, in Judaism there was not only a king and a prophet to distinguish between the executive branch of government and the holy, spiritual branch of government, but there was something called a Sanhedrin, a tribal well of elders who could adjudicate how to interpret the laws, much like a Supreme Court exists today. Judaism very much had a division of powers, but nevertheless, the ultimate final word was vested in the king.
So we're running short on time today, so we have two more questions in the chat, and I'll it up for a question if there is one from someone who's not able to type it in the chat. So the first question that's in the chat is, which law is stricter, the Talmudic law or the Code of Hammurabi?
So the Code of Hammurabi is largely secular laws. They deal with civil society, monetary. For example, the left-hand side of the Ten Commandments, where the Medrash says that Hammurabi took his code from, deal with things like lo tinaf, lo tignov, don't steal, lo tirtzach, do not kill, lo sachmod, do not be jealous of your neighbor, do not covet someone else's wife, laws of adultery. These things for a functioning civil society are contained in the Parsha of Mishpatim in the Torah, and they're largely identical. What Hammurabi did not adopt was the right side of the Ten Commandments, which is that you have to have an absolute belief in God, you have to keep the Sabbath, and things of that nature. Hammurabi did not adapt those. He only adopted the left side. But the ones that he adopted are almost identical to what's contained in the left-hand side of the Ten Commandments.
So the last question in the chat is from Val and says, what takes precedence, the Torah or the law of the land, Dina de Malchuta Dina? And maybe you could explain what that phrase means for those who are unfamiliar with it.
Sure. There's a bedrock principle in Judaism as codified in the Talmud and by Maimonides and the Shulchan Aruch. And that is that as a wandering people, when we are in our own land, the Torah is the supreme law of the land. But nevertheless, when we are guests in other people's lands, we are absolutely bound to follow their laws. The idea that, we're not from this place and we aspire to be in some other place or anything like that, this idea of dual loyalties is the most misappropriated and misrepresented idea. It is totally not a Jewish philosophy. There are no dual loyalties. You can have a loyalty to keep the Torah and its laws, but to the extent there's a secular law in the country you live in, you are bound to follow it, which, by the way, is not a coincidence as to why many Jews found the United States to be a comfortable place to go. Jews weren't always so welcome in the United States. There's many people who went to do work in Hollywood in the 50s. They all had to change their name when they went to Hollywood. There was no Geffen, Katzen, Spielberg in Hollywood in the 1950s. Any person with a Jewish name, from Buddy Hackett to anyone else, had to change it to some secular name in order to get a job. So this idea that there's dual loyalties comes out of ignorance. There are no dual loyalties. We are absolutely bound to follow the laws of the country. And again, without wanting to invite any attacks, is one of the reasons I've been troubled during some of the orders during the pandemic. I think quarantining was probably necessary. I think masks and being careful is something that every common sense person should do and something that makes a lot of sense. But the idea that a governor can order it is not consistent with American jurisprudence. That's why the Supreme Court and every other court who has examined it from New York to California has struck these laws down. Not because they're not good ideas. Of course they're good ideas. We want to keep everybody safe. But take our government here. Take Governor Hogan. He's been one of the more people that's been pro-quarantines, lockdowns, restrictions. He's trying to save lives. I get it. But why is it that in 10 months no one has gone to the Maryland State General Assembly and asked for a law to be passed that these quarantines are in fact within the governor's authority? Where is our legislature? Why are they not part of the process? It is very, very dangerous for any one person to have that much power. What happens if one of the governors in South Dakota decides that from now on you can't have kosher or you can't do circumcision? We have laid the groundwork for all of that because we've said in times of crisis, we're going to allow ourselves to be dictated to by the people that we elected. I agree with most of the things that have been done. I don't want to make this a political thing. It's not a political thing. But as someone who's a student not only of Jewish history, but of American history, I can tell you that before the Declaration of Independence, which codified religious liberties and personal freedoms, the world was a very, very dark place. There were very few places that you could practice religion. There was very few places you could say what was on your mind. As a matter of fact, discrimination and persecution were the law of the land in many places. The Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution changed all that. And to do away with it so easily is something that's very uncomfortable for me, even if I agree with the particular policies of the time.
Well, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead, Beverly.
Yeah, well, what happens, like, in other words, when we've had declaration of war and maybe the majority of people didn't feel like it was a good idea. When you talk about COVID and you think that, I understand, I'm an attorney, I haven't practiced for a couple of years, so I'm a little rusty. But when you have a nationwide issue that is temporarily for the safety, and you almost have to think in terms of that, I'm not sure that I agree with you. I hear what you're saying, and I hear when you say, things have a slippery slope. But I think that when you have such a serious situation, and we realize it, I'm not sure that, as I say, you are the scholar, and I'm just, posing the question. And I would like you to elaborate for me, or maybe somebody else is still interested, why you don't think in a certain situation that that you can sort of bend, I guess.
So I think...
I know it's slippery. I know it's a tough situation. Thank you.
No, I actually think you'd find that we agree much more than we disagree. I'm trying to be equal and point things from both directions, but I'm not saying that the restrictions weren't appropriate. I think in almost every case they were. Obviously, hindsight is 20/20, no pun intended. We know some of the restrictions have worked better than others. But obviously, everyone needs to save lives. And in fact, in virtually every state, there is something called Emergency Powers Act, which is what Governor Hogan's been acting at here. But no one ever envisioned an emergency lasting for 10 months or for 3 years. There is no restriction in Maryland law on the governor's authority to enact an emergency situation. So theoretically, it's a flaw in the Maryland Constitution and statutory scheme, because any person could come along in a different situation and be elected governor and declare a state of emergency indefinitely. There would be no elections. There would be no legislative intervention. That is a very dangerous situation. And I assume and I believe that the Maryland General Assembly, once COVID is done and hopefully in our rearview mirror and hopefully no more people die, I know that's unrealistic, but hoping. But once it's in our rearview mirror, I do think the General Assembly will attempt to modify what the emergency acts that the governor power gives him. Is he entitled to act this way for 30 days, for 6 months? Does he have to convene an emergency session of the legislature? Or can one person simply suspend all rights and all laws? In many other states, there are actually time constraints on how long a state of emergency can exist before there's an act of the legislature. Maryland does not contain such a restriction. But nevertheless, for any one person to have that much power is a very dangerous thing. And again, I full-heartedly say I agree with many of the restrictions that have been put in place. I'm only concerned from a procedural level. What happens when the next governor is an evil person?
Thank you. I agree with you. Thanks so much.
So we have time for one more question.
Can I say something?
Sure, go ahead. You're the last question we have today.
Okay. Well, one comment. Thank you very much for the really fascinating lecture. My understanding is that Hammurabi's code has the death penalty for crimes of property, and that Torah law has no such thing. That is a very interesting difference, that you don't execute someone for theft. He has to pay back damages, and that's one thing I just wanted to mention. The other thing is regarding the similarities between Israel and the United States. Very ironically, one of the biggest first machlokas debates that occurred in Israel was that the left wing and the communist wing did not want to mention God's name in their Declaration of Independence. It's a huge irony, and that David Ben-Gurion, being a man who knew how to compromise with politics, said, we'll call it the Rock of Israel, Sur Yisrael. And that was the compromise, that because it's so vague, what do we mean by Rock of Israel? They let that go, which leads into, that's a whole topic of another lecture about this tension in Israel between the far left and the center, and people who are Masorti, kind of basically traditional but not orthodox, and then you have the extreme Haredi, and it really creates a certain kind of bedlam. but that's a whole lecture in itself. Maybe you'll come back and talk about that some other time. But I wanted your thoughts about that issue.
I'd love to talk to you about that sometime. As a matter of fact, if you look at the draft of the Israeli Declaration of Independence from 1948, there are many crossouts and rewritings of different words. The Israeli Declaration of Independence only reached that compromise when they agreed that the word God would not be mentioned, and it was not referred to as a Jewish state. It was referred to as the State of Israel. When Harry Truman recognized the State of Israel, he had a whole speech prepared to recognize the Jewish State of Israel, and he had to cross out the word Jewish and said just to recognize the State of Israel. And if I could add one more piece to that, I'll tell you that it's fascinating. In 1948, when the United Nations was voting on whether Israel would be an independent state, the big question was the Soviet Union. No one knew how the Soviet Union was going to vote. The presumption was they would be very much anti there being a Jewish state. And they, of course, had veto power. Without the Soviet Union being on board, the whole thing was an exercise in futility. And when it came time to vote, many of you remember the famous Soviet statesman Andrei Gromyko, who later became Secretary of State and their foreign minister and their vice prime minister. He was the ambassador of the United Nations at that time. And the entire world is listening to the radio to see how the Soviet Union was going to vote. And shockingly, Andrei Gromyko voted in support of the creation of a state of Israel. It was later read in many of the secret Soviet papers that the reason for that was because with the kibbutz movement in Israel, the Soviet Union believed that Israel was going to become a communist nation built on socialism and the kibbutz movement. And that was why they chose to support it. But it is a fascinating topic in and of itself. Before we sign off, I really appreciate being here, and it's obvious from the questions how learned and scholarly many of the people are. I want you to know that I don't take this platform for granted. I'm going to give you all my email address. I welcome you to contact me. I'd love to further the discussion, maybe meet up with you sometime because, like I said, I'm sure we all have much more in common than we have that separates us. But in any event, my email is very simple. It's David E, the letter E, David E. Fink, F-I-N-K, at yahoo.com. God bless all of you. May we see this terrible plague behind us soon. May we all remember the Torah values to watch out for our neighbors, to be charitable to those in need, and be a light into the world.
Thank you, Rabbi Fink. Thank you for joining us this morning, and thank you all for being here with us as we start off the